We're here with the Labour candidate for the Sheffield Hallam constituency, Oliver Coppard. So we've just got some questions that we've put together for you. And the first one is, on Monday this week, Ed Miliband announced that he's backing apprenticeships for all school leavers. There was a concern, obviously, further up north, that most jobs are created in the southeast. Will we miss out? Will the constituency miss out on these apprenticeships?
Certainly not if I'm the MP for Sheffield Hallam,
Okay.
that's for sure. I think one of the real problems, as you say, is that kind of up north, our economy, certainly the amount of money coming into this region has been severely hit by the approach of this government.
Yeah.
And that's hit the opportunities for young people, certainly our economy, and the opportunities in terms of jobs and training, etc. So no, I would certainly like to work towards a place where our region, our city, gets all the opportunities that we possibly can from the policy of the government, and be that the Labour government. Certainly I'm working towards trying to get a Labour government in May, but even if the Labour Party are not the government after May and I am the MP for this community, then I will be working as hard as I can to try and make sure that we get the best of all those policies and programmes.
Okay, great. And obviously related to that is that you've said on your parliamentary candidacy website, Sheffield has faced unprecedented funding cuts and financial challenges. You said it's about £175 million cut from our region's European funding.
Yeah.
How will you ensure that this crucial investment funding returns to Sheffield?
Fighting for it is the first thing. So under the last Labour government, what we saw is about £8.3 billion coming into our country from European funding for this particular stream. And what that meant was that our region then got £350 million to pay for things like low carbon projects, third sector funding, skills programmes, small business support, infrastructure projects, things like that, things that really help it to develop and grow an economy and a region. And the Labour government made sure that our region did really well out of that funding, because South Yorkshire is one of the top 10 most deprived communities in Northern Europe, so it was really important that we got the support in order to be able to develop and grow our economy. What we've seen under this government is South Yorkshire and our region be hit when it comes to those funding streams. So despite the fact that the amount of money that comes into the country is roughly the same, what we've seen is places like Scotland get about 5% more money. So Scotland has a higher GDP per head than we do here in South Yorkshire, but they've received an increase, whereas places like Merseyside and South Yorkshire, that are, relatively speaking, pretty poor places, have had a huge cut. Now, I just think that's the wrong approach, and when I've asked Nick Clegg about that policy, he simply refuses to back down. He supports that approach wholly. In my understanding is that decision would have crossed his desk in government, and yet he did not stand up for our community, and it's just not the right approach. The MP for a local area should be standing up for the local area first and foremost. That's the first job of any MP, and Nick Clegg hasn't done it, and if I were the MP, I would be fighting as hard as possible for our community.
Okay, great. So to what extent would you focus the increase in regional and European investment on benefiting the students in Sheffield?
Well, it's about a better economy. So actually, hopefully that supports students, obviously, in terms of kind of opportunities, but also it's about supporting the wider community in terms of the opportunities that they all have as well. So through things like European funding, what we see, and what we saw under the last government, was that paid for infrastructure projects that meant that people could get around more quickly and more easily, so that jobs could be created more quickly and more easily because the economy grows faster. We saw things like business support programs, certainly low carbon projects. I work in the low carbon sector, and I've seen very clearly the effect that the cut has had on the sector I work in and the sorts of things that we're able to do. So we're not able to support projects and programs that otherwise would have created jobs, for instance, in the low carbon sector in our region, that potentially young people and students could have gone into, and those things haven't happened as a result of those cuts. So that isn't a choice based on sort of financial necessity. Certainly this government has said previously that austerity is the reason that they've been making these cuts. Now, I have my argument with their approach in that regard as well, because if you look at Sheffield Council has had £238 million cut from its budget, which is about half the money that comes into the council revenue funding. Whereas actually places like Surrey in the last round of funding saw an increase in the amount of money they received. Now, I think this is about fairness, and this is about supporting places that are not doing so well, places like South Yorkshire in this instance, and giving them more support. So right across the board, that's happened. But in this instance, with European funding, that's nothing to do with kind of the austerity argument, because, as I say, the level of funding that's coming into the region is roughly the same. So it's an ideological choice, and I think it was the wrong one.
So what you're saying, so in terms of going back to the sort of how it's going to affect students, you believe that indirectly the
It's not.
funding
It's not indirectly at all. It's actually it's absolutely directly, because it's about the types of jobs and opportunities that young people, students in particular, get in this region.
Okay.
One of the big problems that we face here is that our economy doesn't grow quickly enough. And that's partly because there aren't those opportunities for businesses to develop and grow. The sort of size and pace of our economy is frankly not good enough. And we need young people, bright young people, coming out of our fantastic universities to stay in this region and develop and grow our economy and contribute to our society. Now, if they can't get the jobs here in our region, here in Sheffield or Sheffield City region, then frankly you will leave, because you will leave and develop your career elsewhere. Now that's a loss to us, and hopefully that's a loss to you, because you want to stay here in Sheffield. And I certainly want to see you stay here in Sheffield as well. But if you can't get those opportunities, clearly you will leave and go somewhere where you can. So it's about creating an economy that you can stay in and develop yourselves and kind of own and push forward, and we want you to do that. But I don't think young people have been given that opportunity thus far.
Yeah, well, I mean, Sheffield has one of the highest retention rates, doesn't it, for students?
Sure, but there's a difference between retention straight after university and then the next step of your career.
Okay, yeah.
So certainly what we've seen is young people may stay in Sheffield after university, so students may stay after university, and that's great, don't get me wrong. But actually, how do you develop your career in an area? And can you get those opportunities? If you're bright and enthusiastic and ambitious, how can you get those opportunities that allow you to develop your career quickly enough? Now, if you go to London, as I did after university straight away, what you can do is you can get one job after the other, after the other, after the other, and you can develop your career really quickly. Now, it so happens I didn't really like living in London, so I moved back home to Sheffield quite swiftly. But most people, or a lot of people, will end up going to London for their second or third job, because that's where the opportunities are.
Yeah.
Now, we need to give people the opportunity to stay and develop their careers here and keep that brain power, that talent in this region, and I don't think we could do a good enough job at that.
Okay. So what are your views on the place of students in national politics, and how are you going to give them more of a voice?
Well, at the moment, I think students have been sidelined to a certain extent by this government. Certainly if you look at things like the gagging law that has been put in place by this government, I think that was an atrocious piece of legislation, and it was actively engineered and designed to try and marginalise the voice of students and young people, and to a certain extent charities and third sector groups. I think it's a terrible piece of legislation, and the Labour Party will repeal it if we're elected in May. But young people need to be heard, really need to be heard. Ed Miliband came here to Sheffield a few weeks ago to talk about this very subject, and spoke at the Sheffield Hallam Students' Union, I'm afraid, sorry, not here, but came to speak and say that we've lost, as a result of individual voter registration, we've lost the changes to how people register to vote. We've lost 1 million people off that register, who therefore no longer have the ability to influence policy through their choices at the ballot box. Young people need to have their voices heard. They need to go out there and be able to shout loudly and speak to people, MPs and people in power, and have that conversation. And in this government, I don't think we've seen that, and the impact has been that those policies that have been put in place have hurt young people. So things like, clearly tuition fees and the policy approach there, but also things like EMA being taken away, certainly things like the sort of benefit changes which are affecting younger people, unemployment which is affecting younger people disproportionately, certainly here in Sheffield, where we have a higher than national average unemployment rate amongst younger people. But the only way that's going to change is if young people get involved in politics and with politicians and with politics, and make sure that the MPs are listening, and certainly that's part of the reason I'm here today.
Yeah, and as you were saying about the registration system, we were talking about this, so students are no longer automatically added, and that's obviously, I think it's led to a loss of, I don't even know the numbers.
So it's 4,000 in Sheffield.
Yeah, and so obviously students can no longer be automatically registered. Would you change it back? Would you try and lobby for that?
Well, I think I'd lobby to improve it dramatically. I think there comes a point where you can't sort of keep on changing these systems, because actually the change is more difficult than actually just keeping it and improving it. So I wouldn't be here to sort of commit to changing that policy, overnight again, because it just causes more disruption and actually potentially means more people drop off the register, or more people are disenfranchised. But so the situation we have right now is that 65% of people in Sheffield Hallam, students in Sheffield Hallam, are registered to vote. And we will certainly work on that some more, certainly as the Labour Party and me as the candidate, but also the council I know are doing some good work on that area as well. So I would hope that it would get to around 3/4 of students in particular in Sheffield Hallam being eligible to vote at the next election. But the reason that it's so high, and that is relatively high, nationally speaking, given the changes that have happened, is because people like Paul Blomfield worked with the MP for Sheffield Central, worked with the University of Sheffield to make sure that the registration process for voting was integrated into the student registration process at university. That's a great system, it's fantastic, but we're the only place to have done that. So Sheffield University is the only university to have put that in place. Now, I don't see why we can't do that elsewhere. Certainly the government could have supported other universities to do that. I know that places like Manchester University were pushing hard for different systems and different processes, and the government haven't necessarily helped them in that regard. So there are ways of making sure that people can vote, even if you keep the individual voter registration system, but supporting organisations like universities, potentially like schools, and the Labour Party will introduce voting at 16, so that schools have a larger role to play in, you know, the educational system in terms of politics, and registering people to vote and supporting them and telling them how to do that and how to get engaged and how to get active. And I think they're all really important things, because young people, as I say, students in particular, need to have a strong voice in order to be listened to, and so that policies don't neglect the role that students play in our society.
So coming on from that, so what would you do to push student interests outside of the whole voting, obviously all that aside, the argument, and the tuition fee debate?
Okay, well, I think it's a bit dangerous, and certainly from my perspective a bit disingenuous, to say there are student issues and there are other issues, kind of as if the two things don't interact or don't have any relationship to each other. As I said before, in terms of the economy, a good economy in Sheffield and a stronger economy in Sheffield that provides more opportunities is great for students and young people, but is also great for the rest of Sheffield as well. So everyone else benefits too. And I think there are a number of issues like that as well. If students are doing well in our system, in our city, you know, and are spending money here, staying here, learning here, you know, developing their careers here, then we all benefit. So I'm slightly wary of separating out the two. Okay. And so, but you know, broadly speaking, this is about giving opportunities to a broader section of society. You know, under this government, I think what we've seen is a certain sort of privileged elite be given more support, and certainly, you know, tax breaks, etc., and support in ways that other elements of society, certainly more vulnerable or hard to reach communities, have certainly not had. So you see things like the sanctions and welfare regime, which has been put in place under this government. You certainly listen over the last sort of 10 days to the rhetoric that we've heard around things like tax avoidance and evasion, and the fact that this government has very little to say on the fact that HSBC and other big organisations are avoiding or evading tax. And yet when it comes to things like so-called benefit scroungers, you know, you cannot get them off the telly. You know, they're very keen to talk about those things. Now, the difference between the tax gap, so the amount of money that is not brought into the economy or into the government's coffers as a result of kind of tax avoiding, tax evasion, all those sort of the difference there is £34 billion. But when it comes to so-called benefit fraud, it's a proportion. It's a tiny proportion. I think is it £2.4 billion. And yet you would think through the rhetoric that the actual problem was those people who are really struggling to get by. We need an economy that works for everybody, and within that, students will do better too.
Okay, yes, that's right. This question's kind of a bit cheeky. We're talking about career politicians, which I realise that you are probably not. As you said, you worked in the energy.
I've worked all over the place.
Yeah. But do you think, in this constituency particularly, do we have a problem with career politicians?
We certainly have a problem with lack of diversity. So if you look at the candidates that are standing here, all white, all, as far as I can tell, to be fair, all kind of relatively middle-aged, although I suppose I'm a little bit younger than that, but you know, kind of relatively middle-aged. So certainly there's a problem there with diversity, but I don't think that's unique to this constituency. I think that's right across politics. I'm wary of having a go at anybody for their background or their gender or their sexual orientation or any of those things, because frankly none of us choose those things about ourselves. So I'm not going to sit here and say that David Cameron shouldn't be the Prime Minister because he went to Eton, or you know, somebody else shouldn't be the Prime Minister because they went to a comprehensive school. I don't think it's about that. It's about the values that you bring to the job. And if you are willing to listen to voices outside of those sort of that small elite circle that you grew up with in some instances, then that's what makes the difference. Listen, I grew up in this community, in this constituency. I went to school here. My family kind of live around here. All my friends are still here. Mm-hmm. In terms of kind of jobs that I've done, I currently work for a local authority in the low carbon sector. So I kind of work to develop community energy projects out in the Dearne Valley, some of the ex-coal mining communities of the Dearne Valley. But I've done everything from kind of handing out yogurts on street corners to working in a steel factory, to being a labourer, to working behind a bar, being a waiter. At my first job I was a bellboy when I was 13 years old. So listen, you know, I've done all sorts of jobs, but I don't think that's necessarily what qualifies me to be the MP for this community. It's about the values you bring to the job, and about the people you're willing to listen to, and the engagement and the policies and the process, and you know, everything. It's a rounder picture. But certainly I wouldn't call myself a career politician. No. I think that's fair to say.
But arguably there might be problem with diversity with the candidates.
Yeah, certainly there's a problem with diversity, I think, but that's not just unique to here, as I say, that's right across politics. We do not have a political system that reflects the society that is supposed to operate on behalf of, and I think that's a real problem. I think that leads to a certain type of politics and a certain approach to politics. So I've certainly tried to be more open and transparent and accountable, the things I've talked about doing should I be elected next May. So I've committed to right of recall and putting that in place, so that if at any point, if I'm the MP for Sheffield Hallam, then and 20% of the electorate in Sheffield Hallam sign a petition saying I've done something wrong within 90 days, I will resign, I'll force a by-election, and I'll let people have their say as to whether or not they want me to stay on as the MP. I will put in place living wage internships in my office, so that people, particularly young people, can come through and learn and understand and get engaged with politics and be supported in doing that. And it's not about how much money you have, because it will be a living wage that is paid to those people. I've talked about publicly being accountable on my expenses, so holding a public meeting every year so that the community can audit my expenses from the previous year in a public environment and tell me whether or not my planned spending for the next year ahead is appropriate and the right way to spend public money too. So it's about that accountability, that transparency, and about those values that you bring to the job, and I think that's what's really important.
Okay, good, thank you. Just my last question. You say that you're, is it like, I think the correct phrase you used was born and bred in Sheffield. Why
born and raised.
Arsenal.
Why do I support Arsenal? My dad's an Arsenal fan. It goes to the heart of trust in politics, right? So it would have been easy to say kind of either I don't like football or I'm a Wednesday fan or a United fan, but listen, I've spent the last 33 years defending Arsenal Football Club in Sheffield, despite obviously at school being sort of having all my mates as Wednesday fans. Kind of that was always a bit difficult. But
I like that it's on your Twitter. It's like a disclaimer.
What's quite funny is that, so of all the things that I say about politics and talking about issues that matter, I think, to a lot of people, the thing that I still get the most grief for is on my Twitter bio. It says Northerner Arsenal fan, and that people still have a go at me about that, and that's kind of the most important thing to a lot of people. Listen, I'm an Arsenal fan, I'm very proud of it, but sometimes it's not the easiest thing here in Sheffield. Yeah, exactly.
Okay, well, thank you very much. That's
my pleasure. Thanks for inviting me
here today.
Cheers.